In this video, I'd like to address the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. In general, everyday language, people may use theory and hypothesis in a very similar manner. Like the cookies are missing from the cookie jar. I theorize that the kids have been eating the cookies, or I hypothesize the kids have been eating the cookies. I mean, in that sense, hypothesis and theory mean pretty much the same thing. But in science, they really have very different meanings. A hypothesis is a tentative statement about the natural world, and we've discussed it a little bit in previous videos. It's typically made with the objective of being tested. So you don't just make a hypothesis for no reason. You make a hypothesis with the idea that either you're going to test it or perhaps someone else will. So it should be testable. A scientific hypothesis must be testable. So we should at least in some way be able to test the hypothesis. So that's a hypothesis. They're fairly limited in scope because, again, the objective is to simply test this idea that you have. A scientific theory is actually much broader. It's an explanation of an aspect of the natural world that has been repeatedly tested and corroborated by observations and experiments. So the idea is that you have a much grander idea. An example would be the theory of evolution. You can see depicted in this picture here, we have, theory of evolution, of course, comes from Darwin. And the idea is that we go from animals that, for example, crawled out of the ocean, so some sort of fish-like organism that turned essentially it through evolutionary processes, through natural selection and so forth. We had the development of tetrapod animals, which were amphibians, as depicted here. From those, we got to reptiles. Reptiles turned into mammals. They also turned into dinosaurs. If we go looking at mammals, we're mammals, of course, and certain mammals are primates. So these were mammals that largely lived in trees and had an opposable thumb, things we've talked about before. So primates, of course, include apes and monkeys. And then as you look at this picture here, we then get to hominids, which are, many of them are extant, but some are extinct. So, but they're closely related to Homo sapiens, which of course are modern human beings. So this was essentially the theory of evolution, that you can go from, through evolutionary processes, you can have changes in form and behavior in animals, and also changes in form in plants and other organisms, living organisms. Another theory in the life sciences would be the cell theory of life. We understand that living things all have cells, so that's sort of the most fundamental basic unit of life is the cell. There's also the germ theory of diseases. If you go back in time, people really didn't understand why people got sick. They thought maybe it was bad spirits or ghosts or something like that. They didn't really understand about germs. So a germ is essentially a catch-all phrase term for things like bacteria, viruses, could even be small parasites. So those are all sort of germs. So we know now that people get sick for a reason, and it may be due to germs. Okay, so those are sort of very broad. You can see that those are very broad ideas that have a lot of implications, and they can be tested in different ways, right? So the theory of evolution we can test by looking at the record of fossils. We can also test it by looking at genes. We have the tools now, molecular tools, to look at genes and see how genetically similar we are to other organisms that are living and so forth. So again, a scientific theory is broader than a hypothesis. It's a general framework for putting together existing knowledge. It ties together observational experimental evidence using a variety of different methods. So this is an important point. So we get lots of information using very different methods. And if we have a broad scientific theory, those methods should essentially bring us to more or less the same conclusion, if the theory is correct. A theory, again, can be, it's so general that it can be used to make predictions. So we're not just talking about, for example, one species of snake or one species of squirrel. We're talking about life in general when we talk about the theory of evolution. And so we can make all sorts of predictions about the interrelationship between different animals and so forth. So again, a scientific theory can be used to make predictions that we found in future observations and experiments. So now, like a hypothesis, it's actually possible for a scientific theory to eventually be replaced by a new theory that has even stronger observational experiment and experimental support. A good example of this would be Einstein's general theory of relativity. It's able to explain some phenomenon better than Newton's theory of universal gravitation. So Newton's theory of universal gravitation is actually good enough to do a lot of things, like send space probes to Mars and so forth. But for certain applications, it's really not sufficient. And so, for example, GPS, global positioning satellite systems, which are used for navigation, they actually rely on Einstein's theory, general theory, relativity theory, because we have to take into account things like time dilation and things like that. So it's not that Newton was necessarily wrong, but we got more data, and in certain applications, we definitely need to go with Einstein rather than Newton. And again, here's a picture just to illustrate a little bit more about evolution, because of course this is a biology class. We have here pictured skulls from various types of Homo. So we're within the genus Homo. Our name is Homo sapiens, right, as a species. So sapiens is the species name, and Homo is the genus name. So within this group of Homo, we have Homo neanderthalensis, we have Homo erectus, and Homo habilis. And you can see here they all have slightly different skull shapes and so forth, and cranial capacities. Okay, so let's move on and just summarize this video. So a theory then is quite different from a hypothesis. It's much broader. It's more extensively tested. It's supported over time with various different experiments and observations. It can be used in a predictive manner. It can explain a broad range of facts. And of course, just like anything else, even like a hypothesis, it can be refuted in the future. So as we get more experimental data and observational data, we may actually change our minds and say, okay, there's something not quite right about this theory, and maybe it needs to be modified a bit. But overall, though, a theory is generally very strongly supported by experimental and observational data. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks a lot for watching.